Yoo-hoo! Do I have your attention? It's me, Menopause Taylor, doing whatever I have to do in order to make you wake up and pay attention to menopause. I'll do whatever it takes to make you recognize what a huge problem it is if you fail to get this education. I'll wear goofy costumes. I'll tell you stories from my past. I'll create quiz questions. I'll construct wacky props. It's all about making sure this education on menopause doesn't go unnoticed. And today, we're going to talk about how endometrial uterine cancer gets your attention so that it doesn't go unnoticed. So this is video number 326. It's the 7th video in our unit on endometrial uterine cancer. And if you haven't watched all the ones that precede this one, you need to watch them first. One surefire way for endometrial uterine cancer and everything else about menopause to go unnoticed is to watch these videos in random order. If you have my book, and I sure hope you do, whether you have the first edition or the second edition, this material is in chapter 31, all of which is on endometrial uterine cancer. But this video will give you more detail than you're going to find in the book. So we're going to talk about the symptoms of endometrial uterine cancer. And the very best way to start is with a quiz question. So here it is. Typical symptoms of early endometrial uterine cancer include A. Pelvic pressure. B. Unexpected vaginal bleeding. C. Pelvic pain. D. Irregular vaginal bleeding. E. A pelvic mass. F. Abnormal vaginal bleeding. G. Absence of vaginal bleeding. H. Constipation. I. Urinary tract infections. J. Urinary incontinence or leaking urine. K. A, B, and C above. L. A, C, and E above. M. B, D, and F above. N. E, H, and J above. Was that easy? Or was it a bit of a conundrum? Well, by the end of this video, you'll have no doubt as to the correct answer, but I won't make you wait to see what it is. Here's the quiz question again with the answer in bold. So, it's unexpected vaginal bleeding, irregular vaginal bleeding, and abnormal vaginal bleeding. Now, you may be scratching your head wondering what the differences are between these three types of bleeding. And if you are, I don't blame you. Unexpected vaginal bleeding, irregular vaginal bleeding, and abnormal vaginal bleeding are all pretty vague terms. And I think vague terms are a setup for confusion. So I'm going to simplify them by telling you this. The bottom line is that the early symptom of endometrial uterine cancer is bleeding when you shouldn't bleed. Bleeding when you shouldn't bleed is the hallmark symptom of endometrial uterine cancer. Now, why do you suppose bleeding when you shouldn't bleed is the classic hallmark sign of endometrial uterine cancer? Well, it goes back to what I taught you in the last video about what happens to cause endometrial uterine cancer. You learned that essentially your uterus begins to fill with more and more layers of gland cells that become more and more disorganized. So the accumulation of multiple layers of abnormal cells is like the stuffing you put in a turkey or other type of animal. And when there's too much stuffing for the cavity to accommodate, it sloughs. In essence, the bleeding that constitutes the hallmark symptom of endometrial uterine cancer is merely sloughing the stuffing. Or, if you're from Texas, it's sloughing the stuffing. Now last week, I demonstrated the stuffing by using this prop. But now that you know that the stuffing consists of bleeding, we can switch to this prop. Don't worry, it's not real. I just painted part of this pad with some red goopy paint. Now, as obvious as unexpected bleeding, irregular bleeding, and abnormal bleeding may seem, you would be surprised at the circumstances under which it does not get the attention it deserves. My favorite way to sum it up is just to say, if you bleed when you shouldn't bleed, then you need to make sure it is not endometrial uterine cancer or one of the processes leading to it. So, if you're post-menopausal without a period for years and you bleed, it could be endometrial uterine cancer. This is true regardless of whether or not you are taking HRT. If you're taking HRT in a continuous regimen on which there should be no bleeding and you bleed, it could be endometrial uterine cancer. If you're taking HRT on a cyclic regimen and you bleed at the wrong time in your cycle, it could be endometrial uterine cancer. And if you're perimenopausal and you bleed at the wrong time, it could be endometrial uterine cancer. But notice that I said it could be endometrial uterine cancer for each of those scenarios. I didn't say it is endometrial uterine cancer. I don't want you to twist information. So often, women learn something like the fact that the early symptom of endometrial uterine cancer is bleeding, and they immediately assume that all bleeding is endometrial uterine cancer. It isn't. So don't freak out if you have some bleeding. Very few women who have bleeding have endometrial uterine cancer. But most women with endometrial uterine cancer have bleeding. The catchy way to remember this is as follows. Only 9% of women with postmenopausal bleeding have endometrial uterine cancer. But 90% of women with endometrial uterine cancer have postmenopausal bleeding. And if you bleed on HRT, don't freak out about that either. Remember, your uterus has been responding to estrogen and progesterone with bleeding since the day you had your first period. Why would it be any different if the estrogen and progesterone are in the form of HRT? Your uterus says, hey, the fertilizer is back, let's grow some grass. And if the fertilizer is back, you have to start mowing the lawn again. So it's usually just a matter of adjusting your HRT a bit. Just be sure to use logic rather than freaking out. As I taught you in video 322 on the risk factors, HRT does not increase your risk of endometrial uterine cancer. It actually decreases it. Now, just a minute ago, I made reference to the fact that bleeding could indicate one of the processes leading up to endometrial uterine cancer. And in video 325 last week, I walked you through the different cell transformations that result in cancer. Remember this? Hyperplasia here is not cancer. Atypical hyperplasia is not cancer. Dysplasia is not cancer. But finally, way down here, neoplasia is cancer. What's really great, actually, about endometrial uterine cancer is that it typically produces the symptom of bleeding when you shouldn't bleed very early in this progression. Sloughing the stuffing usually occurs before the stuffing is full-blown cancer. And that means it's very easy and common to diagnose it when it's merely pre-cancer. I've described some silent diseases in previous units on the diseases of estrogen deficiency. Silent diseases are those that produce no symptoms until it's too late. Well, endometrial uterine cancer isn't like that. In fact, it's usually just the opposite. It causes bleeding when you shouldn't bleed so early that it's easy to avoid cancer altogether. Sloughing the stuffing is a great advantage. And another great thing about endometrial uterine cancer is that it and its pre-cancerous precursors produce a symptom that is impossible to miss. It's really difficult to miss sloughing the stuffing. When your endometrial lining inside your uterus gets too thick and starts shedding, you have vaginal bleeding similar to the all too familiar periods you had throughout your reproductive life, and it gets your attention. Even if you're still having periods, you notice bleeding when you shouldn't bleed. And the same is true if you're on a cyclic regimen of HRT. This early warning sign of bleeding when you shouldn't bleed makes endometrial uterine cancer a very avoidable, treatable, and curable cancer. At one point in a previous video, I told you that all doctors have a 10 most unwanted list of diseases. And I don't think endometrial uterine cancer is on any of their lists. As far as cancers go, endometrial uterine cancer is not a terribly bad cancer. It's one that reveals itself so early that it's usually nothing to fear. Bleeding when you shouldn't bleed, or sloughing the stuffing, is your uterus's way of trying or crying to get your attention. And while it may be alarming at first, it sure is better to have bleeding than for the blood to collect and go unnoticed. And don't forget that not all bleeding is cancer. In the series of cellular changes that lead to endometrial cancer, 3 of the 4 are not cancer. An atypical hyperplasia would be here, but I don't have a card for it. So don't fret. In the vast majority of cases, we make a diagnosis during the pre-cancer phase. Another thing to acknowledge is that not all bleeding is coming from your uterus. But regardless of where it's coming from, it warrants an evaluation. So, in the next video tutorial, I'll discuss how you evaluate bleeding when you shouldn't bleed in order to determine what it is and what it is not. Don't you just love how each video tutorial picks up where the last one left off? It's sort of like a television series. Granted, my cliffhangers aren't nearly as enticing, but at least I try. Here's the summary for today. Endometrial uterine cancer develops slowly by progressing through a series of pre-cancerous steps. At any point in the series, it produces the warning symptom of bleeding when you shouldn't bleed. And that enables you to diagnose, treat, and cure the problem at an early stage. So now I'll tell you goodbye. Don't forget to go to menopausetailor.me for scheduling of consultations. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. Subscribe right here, right now to both my YouTube channel and my newsletter. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you in a week. Bye!